I saw with my own eyes that letter turn to ash in 1943. But decades later, a wounded man walked in, silent, holding that same paper, and every word still bled as if it had been written yesterday. Have you ever forgotten something that burned inside you? Have you ever thrown away a memory so forcefully that your stomach lurched with relief, only for it to come flooding back, years later, as if it had never left? The letter I wrote was my last breath of courage, a confession I should never have committed to paper. When I burned it, I did so weeping, hidden behind the ship's sickbay, like someone trying to bury a secret in a sea that already knows too much. But nothing on that rainy day could prepare me for what came next. Decades later, when the world was already different, and I couldn't even quite remember the sound of my own passionate voice, he walked in, blood-stained, silent, and he held the letter, my handwriting, my name, the same words I burned to save my life, and his. Only that man shouldn't have known my name. And according to the records, he never existed. My name is Mamie Estelle Gibbs. I'm 88 years old. I live alone in a wooden trailer nestled in a forested park here in Oregon. And today it's raining just like that night. The sound of water on the roof is the same, like ancient fingers drumming memories. My hands are slower now, my vision blurrier, but I still know how to recognize what silence demands of me. For decades I've avoided telling this story. I swept every bit of it under blankets and boxes, buried it deep among the albums no one opens anymore. But the empty frame there on the shelf won't let me forget. It was there yesterday, and now it's gone. And maybe that's why I decided to speak. It's not easy to remember, but it's harder to hide. This story, if it can still be called that, wasn't written in books, and it probably isn't in any official record. But it still happened. It happened amidst the clink of surgical tweezers, amid blood-stained cloths, and eyes that silently pleaded. If you're listening to me now, tell me where. Right here in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far my voice can carry, even if it trembles. And if you feel these stories still matter, the ones no one had the courage to tell, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes we need to go back to understand why we were never the same again. I entered the war like someone entering a dark room, feeling the walls and breathing deeply, unsure of a way out. It was 1943. I was 23, with my hair tied back with aluminum clips, and a courage beyond my control. I wasn't forced. No one pulled me by the arm. I went because I wanted to make a difference, because I thought helping was more beautiful than watching. I ended up on a hospital ship floating in the Mediterranean, where the smell of salt, ether, and blood fused together. The deck shook at night with the distant roar of explosions, and in the morning we received bodies, some breathing, others barely. I was a nurse. My white cotton uniform never really turned white after the first month. Sweat ran down my spine even in winter, and the sea breeze seemed to mock us, seeping through the cracks and carrying away the screams we couldn't let out. The floating hospital was a place between worlds, no solid ground, no direct combat. We tended the remains, the pieces that returned, the eyes that had seen too much. Each room had its own sound. The main ward was made of cold metal, with beds so close together that one soldier's sigh seemed to lull another's nightmare. Back then I thought war was measured in battles won. Today I know it hides in the silences that survive. And the silence I carry with me was born there, between the bars of a hidden bed in basement 3, and from a letter that shouldn't have existed. I wasn't much of a letter writer. Never had been. Even when my wardmates talked about their fiancés, the small-town boys, the soldiers who promised to return, I preferred silence. My words always seemed too big or too small, never quite fitting on the page. But that night, amid the heavy smells of the night shift, the fever-soaked sheets, and the sea outside grumbling like a tired old man, I wrote. I wrote because I couldn't keep it inside anymore. Because every time I finished changing his bandages, my fingers trembled a little more than usual. Because, even knowing the risk, even understanding the absurdity, I had already let myself feel. And when we feel too much, the body seeks an outlet. Mine was writing. The light was dim, coming from a portable emergency-type lamp. I hid behind the supply crates where no one passed at that hour. The cold metal of the floor pressed against my legs, but I didn't move. I could only hear my own breathing, trying to be discreet. The words flowed slowly, as if the paper knew what it was receiving. Dear M. That's how I began. I couldn't write his name, or my own. Even there, in the dark, in secrecy, I feared someone would see. The nickname was ours alone. He had called me that, half sleepwalking once. I should have ignored it. I should have forgotten. But I couldn't. No one had called me dear in so long. And even though it was a feverish whisper, it stuck. I wrote about what I remembered of his eyes before the fever, about how he'd go silent when the others shouted, about the way he'd look at me, asking nothing, and about the fear, my fear, the fear that hadn't let me sleep properly since they put him in Basement 3, that makeshift space where we treated cases without official records. The paper was yellowed from the back of an expired form. The pen faltered, but I persisted. Each letter came out in a stutter, as if it, too, were afraid to exist. And perhaps it was, because that letter couldn't exist. Not in that place, not in that war. It was a risk, a confession, a heresy against the military order. And yet I finished it. I slipped it into my sweater pocket. I kept it there for hours. I walked through the hallways, my heart pounding in time with catastrophe. The letter felt warm against my chest. I was afraid someone would smell the graffiti, or that it would burn itself out just knowing it was forbidden. In the infirmary, he slept. His forehead was damp, the sheet rising and falling slowly. I watched him for a while, the letter in his pocket. I wanted to leave it there, next to his pillow. I wanted to do the unthinkable, but fear spoke louder. It always does. And that letter never reached him. At least, not that night. Hold 3 didn't officially exist. At least not on the ship's charts, nor in the sickbay documents. It was an old, disused cargo hold, smelling of rust and sea air ingrained in the beams. Down below, the air seemed still, thick, almost viscous, as if sounds didn't dare to travel. Light came from a single hanging bulb, blinking like a tired eye. That's where they put the sensitive cases. Wounded prisoners of war, men no one wanted to see, men we didn't know whether to heal or forget. And that's where they left M. He arrived in the early hours of the morning, brought in by 2 officers who wouldn't look me in the eye. He was unconscious, his chest bandaged, his boots soaked with blood and sand. He had no name tag, no name, nothing. Just an old scar on his collarbone, and a look that, even dim, seemed to know too much. I was on duty that night. I was called in, without explanation, and simply told to take care of him. Do what's necessary, and don't comment, was all they said. It was a cold order, spoken with that embarrassed urgency that only appears when someone wants to cover up something that shouldn't have happened. For days, I was the only one caring for him. I wasn't recorded in the records. There was no shift change. I would go down to Basement 3 alone with a tray of supplies, syringes, warm water, and fear dripping from the back of my neck. Every time I returned, I felt like I was carrying a wet secret with me, stuck to my skin. At first, he didn't speak. He only moaned softly. The wound in his abdomen was serious, but not recent. Someone had tried to stitch him up before, and badly. There were old bruises, signs of torture, but also gentle hands. It was as if his body were telling several stories, all interrupted. And I started listening with my eyes. I noticed how he clutched the sheet when he heard footsteps on deck, how he turned his face away when I brought in too much light, how he closed his eyes not out of pain, but to avoid the world. And I began to talk to him, quietly, almost as if I were confessing to a living wall. I spoke banalities, the weather, the smell of lunch, what I saw in the upper infirmary, and over time, he began to answer me, with his eyes. That's how I earned permission to call him M. It was the letter embroidered on a torn piece of his shirt, and it seemed enough. He accepted it with a subtle nod. A name that meant nothing, but also didn't deny it. Little by little, he got better. The fever went down. The silence grew longer, more comfortable. I found myself waiting for the moment to go down to the basement, like someone expecting a secret visit. I started bringing extra pieces of bread and a better towel. One day I dropped a dried flower among the medicine. He looked at it as if it were something sacred. Those small exchanges became a language. And that frightened me. Because I knew what came after understanding someone. The desire to save them, but how to save someone who shouldn't even be there. The fever returned on a night when the sea was so calm that even the doctors slept more soundly. The ship glided along as if feigning peace, but down below, in hold 3, his body burned. When I descended with the tray of clean bandages and a damp towel, I smelled the heavy air, the smell of illness mixed with rust, and knew something was different. He was lying on his side, his face turned to the wall, the sheets soaked with sweat. His skin glistened as if the light betrayed him. I touched his forehead with the back of my hand and almost recoiled, hot as iron in the sun. In my haste, I dropped one of the compresses. I knelt beside him, carefully undoing the buttons of his makeshift shirt, and noticed the bandages had come loose. The wound had started bleeding again. But that wasn't all. He was mumbling, disjointed words as if caught between 2 times. I remained still. I lowered my face, trying to understand. The sounds came out in whispers, in fragments of sentences, as if they were the remnants of memories forcibly ripped away. Don't burn. Please. You. I didn't know if I was talking to myself. I didn't know if I was talking to someone who no longer existed. But that paralyzed me. I grabbed a clean cloth and began wiping his forehead, speaking softly, the way you might speak to a frightened child. And then he opened his eyes. Not fully, just enough to see me. For a second, his gaze was so clear, so present, that he seemed sober. You shouldn't have, he said, and then he passed out. I stood there, my hand on his chest, feeling my heart pound like a drum. His open shirt revealed the scar I already knew. But that night, it felt different, as if there was something about it I hadn't seen before. A strange relief at the edge. Thin marks that I would later discover were letters, engraved as if they were part of the skin. But at that moment, all I could do was care. I changed the bandages, the sheets, even changed my clothes afterward. I was so sweaty. And as I cleaned his body, I realized I no longer saw a prisoner there. I didn't see a number, a draft of war. I saw a man carrying something that no one else seemed willing to see. And maybe I had become the sole guardian of this piece of truth. It was also that night that I stopped seeing the uniform, what he wore, where he came from, who he must have been. All of it seemed dissolved in the heat of that fever. The uniform, the war, the orders. Everything melted away, and what remained was just him and me, in a nameless basement, floating among things no one wanted to remember. And it was in that moment, lying on the floor beside the bed, my knees dust-stained and my soul weary, that I realized that letter was still with me, still in my sweater pocket, folded, alive, as if I too had a fever, and for the first time, I considered not destroying it. There was a long, low wooden trunk under my bed in the nurse's station. We each had one. We kept our personal belongings in it, some clothes, papers, mementos, and, in my case, everything I didn't want to explain. That's where I kept the letter, folded 4 times, between a stained handkerchief and a mismatched sock. I placed it there like placing a lit candle in water, hoping not to set anything on fire. For days I slept knowing she was just inches away, and every time I lay down, her weight seemed to pull my body into the mattress. It was as if the trunk breathed, as if it knew what it held. I tried to forget. I convinced myself she was just paper, that she didn't matter, that she would never leave. But whenever the ship rocked hard, I feared the chest would open on its own. I dreamed about it more than once, the latch releasing, the lid slowly rising, and the letter floating to the deck like a doomed leaf. I woke sweating, with the image of her catching fire in someone's hands. One day, during shift change, one of the nurses, Marion, a new girl from Georgia, commented that she'd noticed a strange smell in the dorm. "It smells like old paper. Or burnt paper," she said, laughing, without malice. But it froze me, because I could smell it too, the smell of the letter, as if it exuded something that shouldn't have been written. I thought about tearing it apart, about tearing it into pieces so small, not even the sea could gather them. But every time I touched the paper, my hands hesitated. The folds were already marked, like scars. And the words, they had tone, weight. They existed in a way that couldn't be erased with fear alone. One afternoon I sat with the trunk open before me, the letter in my hand. The setting sun filtered through the cabin's cracks and drew golden lines on the metal floor. The ship rocked slowly, as if breathing with me. I read it silently, as if I hadn't written it, and I cried. I cried for the girl who still thought she could love someone in war. I cried for the woman who now didn't know what to do with it. I closed the chest, but it wouldn't close properly. The latch, once firm, now wobbled. It was as if the wood also knew there was something there that didn't want to be forgotten. And it was at that moment, as the light faded, that I heard footsteps coming from the hallway, quick, muffled haste. I stood up, pushed the trunk with my foot, and pretended to be normal. But the smell of burning paper, it wasn't just in my head. It was as if the letter had already begun to disappear, and I knew that either I had to destroy it now, or it would find a way to survive. The decision didn't come like a flash of lightning. It came like the tide, slow, inevitable, insistent. For 2 whole days I couldn't eat properly. Every time I looked at the trunk, I felt as if there were a heart beating inside that wasn't my own, an irregular, stifled rhythm, as if the letter were calling me or accusing me. And when I heard his name whispered softly by 2 nurses behind the kitchen, I realized I had no choice. War taught us this, that sometimes, to keep someone alive, you had to let them die in silence. I waited for the night shift to end. The ship was asleep in its hypnotic ebb and flow, lulled by a sky covered in thick clouds. I went up on deck in my heavy sweater, the letter tucked into my folded fist. The damp wood creaked softly beneath my feet. No one saw me. I claimed a corner between the lifeboats and the empty supply barrels. A blind spot. A corner I learned to use when I needed to breathe. It was there that I would sometimes go to cry soundlessly. It was there that I would now burn what was left of him. I lit a match, The first one went out in the wind, the second one too. But the third one stayed lit long enough to touch the corner of the letter, and it burned, slowly at first, licking the edges with a timid yellow flame, then hungrier, more urgent. The letters vanished before my eyes, turning into black curves, fragments that rose in thin spirals. Each line vanished, as if it had never existed. But I remembered every word. I felt the weight of every comma, every silence between sentences. And when only ashes remained, I released my hand over the sea. The wind carried some of it away. Another fell straight into the water, dissolving into the darkness. I saw a larger piece float for a moment before sinking, as if resisting the end, as if struggling to return. I sat on the wet ground, hugged my knees, and stayed there. The sky wasn't crying, but my eyes were. It was as if burning the letter had taken a part of me that would never return. I had done the right thing. At least, that's what the world expected of me. To be discreet, rational, to remember that he was the other side, to erase any lines between us. But deep down, I knew nothing had ended there. Because words, when written with the soul, don't die in the fire. They wait, silently, somewhere only time can find them again. And when I returned to the infirmary that morning, my fingers still smelling of smoke, M was awake. He looked at me as if he knew, and just said, "Thank you." He had no way of knowing, but his eyes seemed to say he knew everything. After the letter, something changed in the air on the ship. It wasn't immediate, but subtle, like a crack that lets in a cold breeze even when the window appears closed. Eyes began to linger a second longer on me. Conversation stopped when I entered the sterilization room. And above all, I began to notice the whispers. They were like the sound of invisible rats gnawing at the silence. One afternoon, as I was organizing instruments near the storage room, I heard muffled voices on the other side of the door. 2, maybe 3. Men. The first spoke softly, sharply. The other hesitated as if afraid of hearing too much. Shouldn't have been there from the start. Why no record, no number? You know what that means. And the nurse, the one who always comes down? My blood froze inside. My body remained still, but my senses flared like matches on a dark night. I pressed my ear against the thin wall, trying to catch more. But the sound quickly receded, hard, urgent footsteps. And then, silence. I returned to work with hands of stone. Each tray felt heavier, each syringe colder. Fear gnawed at me. I began to review everything I had done, every glance exchanged, every word spoken. Every time I remained a few seconds too close to M. And then I started noticing the little absences. The IV I'd left on the shelf was gone. A patient's chart from the ward above was missing. One of the towels I'd taken to basement 3 came back stained with something I didn't recognize. Signs. Details no one would see if they weren't looking. But I did. And then I realized they were looking for him. Or rather, they were waiting for him to reappear. The next morning, during the medical officer's inspection, I noticed him walk a little closer to the hatch leading to the hold. His gaze scanned the sides as if counting cracks. His fingers drummed on the clipboard but made no note of anything. As he passed me, the smell of smoke and distrust was almost palpable. That night, I didn't go down. I waited. I watched. The basement was silent. No sound. No cry for help. M knew how to be quiet. He always had. But what troubled me was wondering, for how long? I slept with a heavy heart and dreamed of the letter again. But this time it didn't burn. It was wet, as if it had been pulled from the sea. The words were still legible, and the hands holding it weren't mine. I woke up to a dry noise, like wood being forced. The latch on my trunk. The alley leading to basement 3 was a narrow corridor between the supply bay and the desalination chamber. Almost no one passed through there, except me. And that night, after the dry thud coming from my trunk, I knew I had to act before they did it for me. I didn't give myself time to think. My hands moved on their own, as if obeying an instinct that preceded logic. I grabbed my spare uniform, wrapped a white strip with red paint smeared across it, a makeshift cross, and went downstairs with a tray full of vials of IV fluids and sedatives. But there was something else hidden beneath the cloth. A small key. The only key that would open the life jacket compartment. M was awake when I arrived. He was sitting, his back arched, staring into the corner where the light was fading. His face was paler, but his eyes were sober. He watched me as if he already knew, as if I were the page he was waiting to turn. I knelt beside him, silent, and for a moment there was nothing between us but his breath and mine. Then I handed him a small package folded in cloth. Food, painkillers, a pocket knife, and the key. He didn't ask anything. He didn't even try to smile. He just placed his hand firmly and gratefully on mine. And then he spoke, for the first time since he'd burned the letter. "You remember what you wrote?" That took me apart, because it was true. I remembered. Not just the words, but the silences between them. And in that moment, between that rusty hallway and the flickering lamps on the walls, I realized he remembered too, even though he'd never read it. Or maybe I had read it. I struggled to my feet, my legs weak with tension. I looked around. I listened to the sounds of the ship. Distant footsteps, muffled voices. We were inside a bubble about to burst. "Today at midnight," I said. He nodded. I didn't need to say anything else. I walked back down the corridor with the empty tray, my fingers trembling, my chest hollow. That platter had never seemed so long, and when I reached my cabin, I sat on the floor and rested my head against the wood. I stayed there for minutes that felt like hours. Everything pulsed as if the ship were a giant heart about to collapse. At midnight, the hatch to the life jacket compartment was opened. I didn't see it, but I knew. And that same night, when I returned to the basement with clean cloths to disguise my absence, I found only the unmade bed and a piece of paper under the pillow. Blank, but in my own handwriting. After the escape, basement 3 became a ghost town. The sheets were changed. The instruments were collected. The lamp continued to flicker, as if still trying to give a sign of life. But his bed, his corner, had become a kind of silent altar. And me? I returned there every day, pretending to sterilize what would never be cleaned again. They never reported the leak. They never asked me anything directly. There was only a thicker silence in the corridors, like invisible smoke drifting under the doors. The medical officer seemed to watch me from a distance. And yet they never called me in to talk. Whatever had happened there, no one wanted to know. Or they knew too much and preferred silence. It was that same week that I started writing again. But not like before. I gathered loose papers, expired prescriptions, discarded medical notes. I wrote words that didn't connect, broken sentences, fragmented memories. But every time I tried to rewrite that letter, the original, the one I'd burned, something stopped me. It was as if my hands knew that certain truths could only be spoken once, or else that they had never truly been spoken. I remembered every line. Yes, but now they seemed distant, as if they belonged to another woman, one who existed for only a few days, beneath the earth of basement 3, one who might never have come back up. I thought about writing another letter, one explaining everything, one trying to capture what had happened. But how to explain the invisible? How to write about a man who had no record, who had no name, and yet who knew what I felt even before I felt it? Instead, I started collecting objects. A piece of gauze left over from the last dressing, a button I found near the corner where he used to sleep, a piece of the red sash I used to fake a cross on my uniform. I kept everything in a small box, hidden under my mattress. But I could never sleep properly again. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the burned letter returning. Wet, sometimes on fire, sometimes in the hands of someone whose face I couldn't see. The guilt, that was easy to recognize. It didn't need to be written. It pulsed in my bones, in the way I held my instruments, in the way I avoided speaking when asked about the night shifts. M was gone, but his absence was more vivid than many who still breathed inside. And when, one morning, I found the blank note under my pillow, I realized what it wanted to tell me, that the letter I destroyed still existed, in another time, in another place, or in someone, because certain words don't die, they hide, and they wait. It took more than 40 years for me to see him again. 40 years of well-swept silences, of closed drawers, of faces that couldn't remember what their eyes had seen. I retired with discreet honors. I became a respectable shadow in a small rural town. I tended plants, knitted, and organized boxes in silence. The war became the past, and the past became a place I refused to enter without gloves. Until one night in my late 70s, I received a call from a former colleague, Evelyn, now a volunteer at a temporary shelter for injured and survivors of road accidents. She'd called me because a strange case had appeared. The clinic was a makeshift facility in a gym. There were no files, no names, just people trying to remember who they were, or deliberately forgetting. I arrived on impulse. I don't even know why. Maybe because she mentioned the word silent. Maybe because she said he had something in his pocket that no one understood. Maybe because it was time. When I entered the room, he was lying on a thin stretcher, the sheet pulled up to his chest. He was asleep, or pretending to be. His beard was overgrown, his hair was gray. He was thin, the sunken face of someone who'd endured more time than he should have. His eyes were closed, but his right hand was holding something, and the world stopped. It was a yellowed piece of paper, dubbed 4 times, stained on one corner, and even from a distance I knew. I knew the texture, the thickness, the invisible weight. I approached slowly, my heart beat with a rhythm I only recognized too late, the same as when I burned that letter on deck. I touched the paper. The folds were the same. When I turned the first flap, I recognized my handwriting. Every word, every curve of the letter, every hesitation turned into a sentence. The letter, the same letter I burned in 1943, was there, intact. My hands were shaking. The words swam before my eyes. It was as if I were reading something buried within me, something that should never have survived. And then he opened his eyes, not abruptly but gently, as if awakening from within me. He looked at me for a few seconds that stretched time, and said in a worn but clear voice, "You still remember." And I knew, in that moment, that everything I had buried was still alive, and that that letter never truly burned. Or maybe it burned down, but what she said survived. He held out the paper to me with an almost childlike gesture, and on the back, where I had never written, there was a sentence, in my handwriting, but I didn't remember writing it. I held the paper like someone holding a newborn, carefully but also fearfully, because there was something sacred or profane about that sheet. It didn't tremble, it didn't crumble, It didn't smell of ash, and yet every inch of it felt like a dirty mirror pointed back at me. The words were there, exactly as I'd written them, the same uncertain phrases, the same tone somewhere between tenderness and guilt. The signature faded, as if I'd hesitated even in saying goodbye. But what caught my attention was the verse. On the back, in my own handwriting, identical to the lines of the original letter, was a sentence I never wrote. I know this as I know my hand is slower, shakier these days. The sentence read, "I came back because you never let me go." I read it so many times I lost count. I wondered, had I written it in my sleep? Had I copied it and forgotten? But there was something in the tone that wasn't mine. It was too intimate, too direct, as if it came from within me, but filtered through someone who knew me from another time. Someone who had traversed the same shadows as me, but at a different pace. I looked at him. He sat, calmly observing my reactions. There was no rush in his eyes, no pressure. Just the kind of silence I knew in Basement 3. The silence that holds the world's breath. "Was it you?" I asked. He just nodded. But what disturbed me most wasn't the fact that he had the letter. It was the handwriting, the age of paper, the crease marks, the same as the ones I had made with my own hands, on a wet deck, under the creaking of the ship. The same corner where the flame first touched. The same salt stain that fell when I cried. That wasn't a copy. Error on paper. But how? He seemed to read my thoughts. "Some things don't want to be forgotten," he said. The words floated in the air between us. And for an instant, everything I'd experienced in the years since, the lukewarm marriages, the silent dinners, the locked drawers, all of it vanished. I was left alone with that girl who wrote hidden behind the boxes. The girl who didn't know that love and danger sometimes shared the same face. I sat down next to him. The letter was shaking less than I was. I closed my eyes. And for the first time since 1943, I let a memory embrace me completely. No fear, no explanation, because the impossible sometimes is all that's left when the truth refuses to die. We remained silent for a time I couldn't quite fathom. I held the letter open on my lap, his eyes fixed on mine as if watching over an ancient flame. The volunteer nurse who had shown us into the room appeared in the doorway, and upon seeing us together, hesitated for a second. Perhaps she sensed something there that escaped what one would expect from a reunion. Or perhaps she simply noticed the way my fingers touched the paper, as if recalling an ancient dance. "Do you know each other?" she asked. Before I could answer, he said, "She called me M." I closed my eyes. That letter, that single letter, he pronounced it with a dry sweetness, like someone who's lived too long, repeating a name in his mind, just to keep it from dying. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I could only nod. The volunteer smiled kindly, excused herself, and left us alone. The click of the door sounded like a seal being placed on something that would never be opened again. He leaned in slowly, as if carrying pain in his bones, and asked me, "Do you remember what I whispered? That last night?" And it was like the ground dropped out from under me, because I remembered. But I had buried that memory so deep that my entire body stiffened as I accessed it. It was that early morning, just before the escape. I was kneeling, adjusting the bandages one last time, and he, half conscious, pressed his lips to my ear and said, "Mamie, come back to me one day, even if it's just a thought." I never told anyone about this. I never wrote. I never repeated it even to myself. But now he was there, looking at me, and saying it again, as if the time between sentences had just been a pause too long. "Come back to me." My chest tightened. It was as if the woman I'd been in that basement still lived in some crevice of my body, and for a moment, everything in me seemed to listen. "You said you would come back to me in your thoughts," he repeated. "And you did." The letter was still in my hands, but now it felt lighter. Or maybe I felt lighter, because there was a name lost between us, and now it had returned. It wasn't the full name. It wasn't an identity. But it was the password, the gesture, the whisper that sealed everything that had been said between the words. He touched my shoulder with his fingertips. "You never forgot me, Mamie. That's why I was able to find my way." And that's when I understood. He didn't need anything else. No explanations. No forgiveness. Just that moment when the right name meets the right silence, and everything aligns for a second, as if time bows in respect. The next day I returned to the clinic early. I slept poorly. I dreamed of rough seas, endless corridors, and letters being spat out of wooden boxes. I woke to the sound of rain beating on the trailer roof, the same sound from that night in 1943, and with the metallic taste of something that shouldn't be remembered. When I arrived, he was being examined by a team of volunteers. He sat in a wheelchair, thin, covered with a worn wool blanket. I could see he was waiting for me. His eyes found mine before I even called out to him. When I approached, he extended his hand naturally, as if inviting me to an ancient dance. "Would you like to help me change the dressing?" the nurse said, smiling sympathetically. I nodded. I grabbed the gloves, the cotton, and the bottles of antiseptic. His shirt was open. His chest bones were visible, his shoulders covered in age-stained spots. But what froze me was his left side. Just below his collarbone, above his ribcage, a thin, pale scar with raised edges, the kind of scar the body carries for decades, never to be forgotten. I knew that brand. It was the same one Em had. I had cleaned her, touched her, protected her. Days on end in Basement 3. She was my secret signature on it, but his was on the wrong side. Left side, when I remembered the right. I closed my eyes, as if searching for a photograph in my mind. I relived the gestures, the bandages, the position of the bed. I was right. I'd always treated the scar on the right side, but now, there it was, on the opposite side, identical in shape, identical in texture, but like a reflection in a mirror. A mistake, a memory error, or a misplaced memory, as if time had returned something crooked. He watched me. He knew I noticed. And he said nothing, because there was no need. The doubt was the message itself. Maybe he wasn't M, or maybe it was a reflection of something left behind. An echo, a fold in time where the marks blur, but still recognize who touched them first. "Do you remember what you saw?" he whispered softly. I nodded with a lump in my throat. "Then maybe the part of you that let me go is still alive inside you." I stepped away carefully, the bottle of antiseptic still in my hand. My head said that was impossible. My body wasn't so sure, because sometimes a scar changes location, but the pain that created it doesn't go away. And that made me think, what if everything I tried to forget never really left me? After the scar, after that body mirror that didn't match my memory, I returned home carrying the weight of a question I couldn't even formulate. I spent the night rummaging through my old boxes, folders, old letters, pieces of myself archived over the years. The letter was still with me, folded more carefully than it should have been. But my heart, it was the most out of place. The next morning I went to the city's Veterans Center. I took with me the remaining wartime documents, my faded badge, a photo of me standing next to the hospital ship's infirmary. I said I needed to confirm a name, a patient, A man who passed by our ship in 1943, wounded, unidentified. I gave the letter. M. That's it. One letter. The kind employee typed as she offered me tea. I stared at the screen, expecting anything. A spelling error, a truncated record, a trace. But there was nothing. No record. Not even a nickname. Not even an occurrence. There is not even any record of the existence of a Hold 3 in that model of ship. I showed her the photo, the one with the shadow in the background, barely visible, leaning against supply crates. I swore it was him. She zoomed in, squinted, gave me a look of polite doubt, and simply said, "Maybe it's just a shadow, ma'am." I left there with my soul torn into thin layers. I went back to the clinic. I spoke to the volunteer nurse, the same one who had called me days earlier. I asked for the man's file, his name, his medical records. She hesitated. Then he said, "He doesn't have it." Like this? He didn't arrive with any documents. He didn't give his name. He doesn't say where he came from. And no one knows who left him here. That sentence went through me like a cold nail. He has no record. 40 years later, and he was still the injured one, not on the list. Just like before. As if everything had returned exactly to where it left off. A loop, an echo, a story refusing to be erased. I returned to the room where he was resting, and for the first time I spoke with a choked voice. "You were never in the records." He looked at me with calm tenderness, and he answered, "But I was always in you." I held the letter tighter. That was it. The paper was there. The body was there. The scar, almost the same. But in the world of names, numbers, files, he remained a nobody. But for me, he was everything I couldn't forget. And maybe that was exactly what he came to collect. That night I returned home early. The path along the road between the trees seemed quieter than ever. The rain had stopped, but the smell of wet earth still wafted through my nostrils like incense from the past. When I parked the trailer, I noticed one of the curtains was pulled differently. A small detail, but enough to make me stop before opening the door. Nothing was out of place. And at the same time, everything seemed so. I walked around the kitchen, leaned my coat against the chair, and poured myself some tea I hadn't drunk. I went to the bookshelf. My gaze searched, unsure of what it was I was looking for, until I realized the dark wooden frame that always sat next to the radio wasn't there. It was an old, faded photo. Me, at 23, sitting with 2 other nurses on the deck of the hospital ship. They were all smiling. I wasn't. My gaze was fixed on something off-camera, as if I saw more than I should. But what made me keep that photo there wasn't the portrait itself. It was the background. There, blurred and almost imperceptible, was a silhouette among the shadows. Almost invisible, almost erased by the evening light. I always thought it was him. I never showed it to anyone. I never said it out loud. I just knew. And now, that photo was gone. I rummaged through drawers, looked behind books, under the bookshelf. Nothing. I even opened the trash can. Empty. No fallen frames. No chance of it having come loose by accident. She just disappeared, as if it had never been there. I sat on the sofa with the now cold tea in my hands. I looked at the non-existent steam and felt something had changed. Not just in the bookshelf, in me. The absence of that image weighed more than its presence ever did. And yet, I knew exactly what the photo showed. I remembered the shape of the shadow, the way he held something in his hands. Maybe a cloth, maybe an envelope, or a letter. I touched the pocket of my sweater. The letter he returned to me was still with me. I opened it slowly as if I wanted to find the photo there again, between the folds. But the back, was now clean. The phrase, "I came back because you never let me go," had disappeared, leaving the paper as blank as the wall where the frame used to rest. I sighed, leaning my head against the upholstery. Some presences are stronger when they disappear. And maybe he had taken the photo because, somehow, it was his ticket back. A blurred portrait, a burned letter, and what remains. Between the two, I returned to the clinic late in the afternoon, like someone returning to a wake where the body has already been buried. But the smell still lingers in the room. The windows were open, and the air carried a late-season freshness, the kind of breeze that's neither hot nor cold, just damp with memory. He sat on the back porch, covered by a brown blanket, his eyes fixed on the hazy horizon. The chair creaked under his light weight. I knew it was the last time. I don't know how, but I knew. I sat down next to him without saying a word. The world seemed to pause. He looked at me with a gentleness that dissolved all questions. And his eyes weren't the same anymore. They didn't carry the weight of the secret nor the mystery of the letter. They carried something else. Forgiveness. But not the kind of forgiveness that is asked for. The kind that offers itself, as if even without having made any mistake, we still deserved to be absolved for having felt too much. We stood there watching the sky darken, the tree lines slowly disappear. "You saw me when no one else did," he said quietly. I just nodded. "And now, you can let me go." The words pierced me with the sweetness of a clean cut. I took the letter from my sweater pocket. I opened it again. It was still there, my handwriting, the old creases, the tear stain in the corner. But then again, on the back, there was a sentence. This time, it was different. "I was you, when you had to forget me." My eyes filled up. He didn't explain anything to me. It wasn't necessary, because at that moment I understood that he was not just a man. It was the space between what I was and what I needed to erase to survive. It was the living form of what is lost, but never goes away. He smiled and his face dissolved into the late afternoon like good smoke. And then he got up slowly and walked into the clinic. I never saw him again. I don't know if he left by car, by ambulance, or if he disappeared like a burnt letter. But I know that, since that day, I haven't heard the rain in the same way. The rain returned today, gentle, like the day I wrote the letter hidden behind the boxes in the ship's hold, and like the day he reappeared, holding the impossible. I'm sitting in the armchair of my trailer, my heavy sweater draped over my shoulders, my mug of tea cooling on the coffee table. The steam is no longer rising strongly, but it still dances. The curtains are drawn, leaving just a crack for the gray light from the wet trees outside. On my lap, the letter. I folded it with the same care that a young woman uses when falling in love for the first time. I don't know how she survived. I don't know if he was real or if it was a part of me that returned in another form, asking to be remembered. But I know what I felt. I know what I still feel. I went back to the bookshelf, and there, in the place where the photo had disappeared, there was another frame, identical to the previous one, but now with a different image. It wasn't an ordinary photo. It was a collage, as if handmade. In it, my young silhouette on the deck of the ship. And in the background, a shadow, clearer than ever before. The man, M, holding the letter. In the bottom corner, in very small letters, it was written, "Some truths don't need to be remembered, just returned." I touched the glass. Smile, sad, serene. There are things that don't make sense, and there are feelings that don't need to, because what we experience doesn't always fit into words or into files. Sometimes it only fits in the silence between two people, between flame and ash, between what was written and what could never be read. If this story touched you, please comment here where you're listening from. I'd love to hear how far this letter reached. And tell me, what would you have done?